Okay, so get this. What if your love of languages, like, speaking French or Spanish, could actually help unlock the secrets of DNA?
Yeah, it might sound a little out there, but there's
Right.
some actual research going on right now exploring those connections.
Really?
Yeah, between how we understand, human languages and the language of life itself, DNA.
That's pretty wild. So, what are we looking at today?
Well, there's this paper that basically asks, could being multilingual, like speaking multiple human languages,
Mhm.
actually make it easier to understand DNA?
Mm.
And they actually put this to the test.
Okay, hold on. Before we get too deep into this, how do you even test something like that? I mean, how do you compare speaking French to, like, understanding genes?
Right, so they had to come up with some clever ways to measure this. So they focused on three specific tasks. The first one was sentence similarity in languages. So like figuring out how alike two sentences are in meaning.
Okay, makes sense.
And then they applied that same idea to DNA, looking at how similar different DNA sequences are.
So, like, comparing sentences to strings of DNA?
Exactly. And then the final task was protein prediction, which is basically trying to figure out which proteins a stretch of DNA will actually create.
Oh, wow, that's getting pretty complex. So, did they just, like, find people who spoke a bunch of languages and make them do DNA tests, or what?
Not quite. They used AI models for this, which is pretty cool. They trained these models on various tasks. Some were trained just on languages, and some were trained on both language and DNA data.
Okay, so kind of like a brain Olympics for AI with both language and DNA
That's
rounds.
a great way to put it, yeah. And to really compare how they did, they used this framework called Extreme.
Extreme.
Yeah. It was originally designed for, seeing how well AI understands multiple human languages. But in this study, they kind of repurposed it to see how these models performed on those DNA tasks we were talking about.
So, like, taking a language whiz who speaks like a dozen languages and dropping them into a biology lab to see if those language skills help them crack the code of DNA.
That's the idea. And the results were actually pretty surprising.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat here. What did they find?
Well, for the DNA sequence similarity task, those models trained on multiple languages did amazingly well.
Really?
Yeah, up to 89% accuracy, which was, way better than anyone expected.
So basically, knowing a bunch of languages might actually give you a secret advantage when it comes to understanding DNA.
That's what it suggests. And it kind of hints that there might be some deeper underlying structural similarity between human language and DNA sequences, which is really fascinating.
That's incredible. But wait a minute, if they were so good at, like, seeing the similarities in DNA sequences, does that mean they could also predict the proteins those sequences make?
You'd think so, right? But that's where things get even more interesting. Because while those AI models aced this sequence similarity task, they really struggled when it came to protein prediction.
So even though they could see the patterns in DNA, they couldn't actually translate those patterns into, the actual proteins they create.
Exactly. It seems like the complex biological processes involved in making a protein from a DNA sequence, it requires a different kind of translation, one that goes beyond just understanding human languages. It's not a simple one-to-one mapping.
Wow. Okay. So it's more complicated than we initially thought. What other factors did they find that kind of played into this whole language DNA connection?
Well, one big factor was the length of the DNA sequences. Shorter sequences were way easier for those AI models to handle.
Kind of like how shorter sentences are easier for us to understand.
Exactly. But here's the really interesting part. They found that the DNA analysis results were way more sensitive to just random stuff in the AI training process compared to the language tasks.
So, like, little variations in how the AI is trained could have a big impact on its performance, especially with the DNA stuff.
Yeah, precisely. It seems like applying those language skills to DNA might be way more delicate and prone to like random variations than we initially thought.
Okay, so this is already getting pretty complex. But before we go any further, can you explain what you mean by multimodal models? You mentioned them earlier, and I'm not sure I get it.
Right, good point. So multimodal models, they're AI models that are trained on not just one, but multiple types of data. So in this case, they train some of those models on both language data and DNA data right from the start.
Oh, I see. So it's not just about training them on languages separately, but kind of giving them a crash course in both languages at the same time.
Exactly. And what they found is that this dual training really seems to improve their ability to connect the dots between language and DNA. Like imagine exposing the AI to both a massive library of books and a detailed map of the human genome. It gives them this broader perspective that might help them see those hidden connections that we're talking about.
That's fascinating. So it's almost like giving them a superpower. But before we go any further, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back to uncover more of the findings from this research and what it all means for the future of linguistics, genetics, and maybe even humanity itself.
Definitely. There's much more to explore. So welcome back. I'm really excited to unpack some more of these findings.
Me too. Before the break, we were talking about how the length of those DNA sequences can affect those AI models and how well they do. But there's like this other layer to it that I find really interesting, and it has to do with like how stable the results are.
Yeah, you're talking about how those DNA analysis results were way more sensitive to just random variations in how those AI models are trained, right?
Exactly. So like even tiny changes in how we train those AI models could totally change their performance, especially when it comes to DNA, which seems kind of like a big deal.
Yeah, for sure. It really suggests that applying all that knowledge we have about language to DNA is probably way more complicated and less predictable than we thought. It's not a simple equation.
Right. It's not just about finding these like surface level similarities, but actually understanding how those similarities work in the real world, which seems way more intricate.
It is super complex. And a lot of times those major scientific breakthroughs, they come when we move beyond those basic observations and really dive into the messy details.
Okay, so speaking of those messy details, they also looked into different languages and how well each one transferred to understanding DNA, right?
Yeah, exactly. They wanted to see if some languages were just naturally a better fit for understanding DNA than others.
Oh, that's interesting. So did they find like a winner? Like is French the secret to understanding DNA or something?
Well, not exactly a clear winner, but they did see that models trained on Chinese seem to do a little bit better on those, biological sequence tests than others.
Hold on, Chinese. Any idea why that might be?
That's the crazy part. The researchers didn't actually look into the specifics of why Chinese might be better, but it definitely brings up some really interesting questions. Maybe there's something about the structure of Chinese or the way it works that just makes it more suited to understanding DNA.
That's so wild. Maybe we should all start learning Mandarin to unlock the secrets of our genes. Okay, probably not, but it does make you think. So, earlier you were talking about how pre-training those models can like really affect their ability to make those connections between language and DNA. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so, most of these big language models are trained on tons and tons of text data, but that usually doesn't include any biological sequences, right?
So it's like sending them into a DNA challenge with a brain full of language, but they've never actually seen like the language of life itself.
Exactly. And to see if, that lack of biological pre-training was holding them back, the researchers did this really cool thing. They basically trained a GPT-2 model, but this time they threw in DNA and protein sequences along with all that English text.
Oh, so they basically made a model that was like bilingual from the very beginning, exposed to both human language and the language of biology, right?
Yeah, exactly. And those results were huge. That model, the one that was pre-trained on both, it showed way stronger language transfer abilities compared to that one that only had the English pre-training.
So it's like giving them this head start in figuring out how those two, seemingly different worlds of language and DNA actually connect.
Exactly. And, that has some pretty big implications for how we train these AI models for tasks that involve lots of different fields, right?
Absolutely. So it's not just about training them on one thing, but exposing them to like this whole buffet of data from the get-go, right?
Yeah, totally. It's like giving them this, toolbox filled with different skills and knowledge so they can be more flexible and ready to tackle all those new challenges.
Makes sense. So, okay, let's talk real-world applications. What does all this research actually mean, like, practically speaking?
It's still kind of early, but these findings could lead to some really cool possibilities, especially in areas like scientific research, drug discovery, maybe even things like personalized medicine.
Okay, now you've got my attention. Give me some concrete examples. How could this research actually help people in the real world?
Just imagine using AI to analyze a patient's DNA to figure out their risk for certain diseases, or tailoring treatments to their specific genes. We could even design completely new drugs based on this deeper understanding of, how proteins work in our cells. It could seriously revolutionize medicine.
That's mind-blowing. It sounds like we're on the edge of like this whole new era of medicine where language and biology are working together to like actually improve people's lives. But before we get, too carried away with the future, I think we should take a moment to appreciate how creative those researchers were. I mean, they really had to think outside the box to come up with these experiments to connect language and DNA.
Oh, totally. And like, especially the way they dealt with that DNA sequence length thing, it's really clever how they found a solution that didn't just involve like throwing more computing power at the problem.
Yeah, exactly. It shows how important it is to be both like creative and rigorous in science. But before we move on, there's one more thing I wanted to touch on. The researchers also looked at how the size of the AI model impacted their ability to transfer that knowledge between language and DNA. Did they find that bigger is always better?
That's a great question. And they actually experimented with different sizes of that GPT-2 model, from the smaller GPT-2 small to the giant GPT-2 XL.
So what did they find? Was it like a straightforward, bigger model equals better performance kind of thing?
Surprisingly, no. While that largest model, the GPT-2 XL, did have the best overall performance on those language transfer tasks, the improvements over that much smaller GPT-2 small were actually pretty small.
So it's not always about just throwing more computing power at it.
It seems that way. The researchers were actually really impressed by how well that smaller GPT-2 small model did, which is pretty encouraging because it means that even with like less resources, researchers can still make big contributions to this field.
That's really great to hear. Okay, so this research is honestly mind-blowing, and I feel like we've covered so much ground. Let's take a moment to just process all this amazing information before we jump into the last part of this deep dive, where we'll explore the potential implications of this research for, the future and everything.
Sounds good. We'll be right back.
Okay, so we're back, and my brain officially buzzing. We've been talking about these like crazy connections between human language and the language of DNA. It's really made me think about both of them in a whole new way.
You know what's even cooler? These findings, they don't just make us like rethink language and biology, but they also suggest a whole new approach to science itself. You
Oh,
know,
I'm listening. What do you mean?
well, for so long, different fields of science have been kind of like, working in their own little bubbles, each one with its own jargon, its own methods. But this research is like, hey, what if we actually break down those walls and encourage those fields to work together, even fields that seem totally different?
So like linguists and geneticists could actually like learn from each other. That's pretty out there.
It might seem a little weird, but yeah, that's exactly what this research suggests. Linguists, they're experts at analyzing patterns in language, understanding structure, all that stuff. Those skills could be like super valuable in genetic research, especially as we get more and more data from DNA sequencing.
It's crazy to think about linguists like working side by side with geneticists, helping to decode DNA and find those like hidden messages in our genes.
Right. And who knows what other crazy connections we could find if we just bring together experts from different fields. This research just shows us that the coolest discoveries often happen when different perspectives collide.
It's pretty inspiring. And, we talked about some potential applications in medicine, but what about other areas? Like, could this research impact things like agriculture or environmental science?
Oh, totally. The possibilities are huge. Imagine using AI to analyze the DNA of crops to make them more resistant to diseases or pests, or even to help them survive in like a changing climate.
That could be a game changer for like food security around the world.
Exactly. And even in environmental science, these AI models could help us understand ecosystems, predict how climate change will affect biodiversity. We could even use them to design strategies for cleaning up pollution using, living organisms. It's called bioremediation.
Wow, it really seems like the possibilities are endless. This research could impact like so many aspects of our lives.
It really could. But, with any new technology, especially something this powerful, we need to be careful. We need to think about the ethical side of things and the potential risks, you know.
You're right. We have to be responsible with these technologies. We have to make sure everyone has access to them and that they don't just like make existing inequalities worse.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We need to have open and honest conversations about all of this, not just scientists, but everyone needs to be involved in this conversation. And it needs to happen now before these technologies get so advanced that we lose control. you know?
Wow. This whole deep dive has been incredible. We've explored these wild connections between human language and DNA, and it's opened up all these possibilities in medicine, agriculture, the environment, and who knows what else. It feels like this research raises more questions than it answers, but that's kind of the exciting part of science, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
And as we keep pushing those boundaries of knowledge, we have to be thoughtful. We have to
Mhm.
consider the impact on humanity and, like, the whole planet.
Well said. So, if we can find these crazy similarities between the language of life and the languages we speak, what other hidden connections are out there, right? It's a question that should get anyone thinking, anyone who's ever wondered about, the mysteries of the universe and our place in it.
It definitely makes you wonder.
It makes you wonder. Well, this deep dive has definitely sparked my curiosity, that's for sure. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey. And to everyone listening, keep asking those questions, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.